Move along, Grandpa. This isn't a senior social club. The range is for serious shooters, the muscular range supervisor barked, his reflective sunglasses hiding any semblance of empathy as he pointed toward the exit. Walt Harrison, 78, carefully set down his worn leather shooting bag, the abrupt dismissal causing his weathered hands to tremble slightly. He'd just been hoping to spend a peaceful afternoon at the public range, a simple pleasure he'd allowed himself each month since retiring. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I paid for my lane time, Walt said quietly, his voice carrying a dignity that seemed lost on the supervisor. The range was busier than usual that Saturday, a special training day when Navy SEAL candidates from the nearby naval base were given supervised civilian range access as part of their urban combat familiarization. The facility hummed with the controlled chaos of serious shooters, military personnel, and the occasional gun enthusiast. Walt Harrison lived alone in a modest single-story house on the outskirts of Virginia Beach. His life was ordered and deliberate. Breakfast at 6 a.m. sharp, a short walk to keep his joints moving. The daily newspaper read cover to cover, and dinner precisely at 5:30 p.m. The walls of his home bore no medals or commendations, just a few faded photographs, landscapes from distant shores and groupie, shots of men whose faces had grown indistinct with the passage of decades. Once each month, Walt would retrieve a peculiar case from the back of his bedroom closet. It contained 2 handguns, a well-maintained 1911 .45 caliber pistol, government issue but modified with custom grips, and a more modern 9mm Sig Sauer. He would clean them meticulously, regardless of use, a ritual performed with the precision of someone who'd once depended on his weapons for survival. Today was range day. Walt had arrived early, as was his custom, dressed in pressed khaki pants and a faded navy blue polo shirt that had seen better days. Over this he wore an unassuming windbreaker, its fabric worn thin at the elbows. Nothing about him suggested anything other than an elderly hobbyist, perhaps a retired accountant or school administrator, keeping up a casual interest in marksmanship. The Atlantic Shores shooting range was a sprawling facility, recently renovated with electronic target systems and state-of-the-art safety features. It catered to civilian enthusiasts, law enforcement, and occasionally military personnel from the numerous bases dotting the Virginia coast. The range supervisor, Chad Dennison, had been hired for his extensive knowledge of firearms and tactical experience as a former police officer. What he lacked, however, was patience for those he deemed casual shooters, especially the elderly ones who, in his estimation, posed safety risks and took up valuable lane time. Walt had secured lane 12 midway down the range and had just begun unpacking his shooting bag when he noticed the unusual activity. 2 lanes down, a group of young men in navy t-shirts and tactical pants were receiving instruction from a hard-faced man with the unmistakable bearing of a military instructor. SEAL candidates, Walt surmised, recognizing the intensity in their eyes, a look he knew all too well. He continued his preparations methodically, setting out his pistols, arranging his ammunition boxes, and carefully positioning his targets. His movements were deliberate, economical, the actions of someone who had performed these same motions thousands of times. He slipped on his hearing protection and safety glasses, then stood at the firing line, taking a moment to collect himself. The first shot from his 1911 struck the target dead center, so did the second, and the third, and every shot thereafter. There was nothing flashy about Walt's shooting, no rapid fire, no fancy stances, just a steady, rhythmic precision that spoke of decades of practice. He fired 5 rounds, then carefully placed the pistol down, pressed the button to retrieve his target, replaced it with a fresh one, and repeated the process. The holes in the center of each target formed tight groupings that would have impressed even the most seasoned marksman. Chad, the range supervisor, had been watching the SEAL candidates with admiration, occasionally offering unsolicited advice to their instructor, who tolerated his presence with professional courtesy. When he noticed the old man in lane 12, firing with such precision, his first reaction was disbelief, then suspicion. "Sir," Chad said, approaching Walt from behind, tapping him roughly on the shoulder during a ceasefire period, "I need to see your range card and membership." Walt carefully safed his weapon before turning around, removing his hearing protection. "Of course," he replied, reaching for his wallet to produce the requested credentials. Chad examined them, with obvious skepticism. "Walter Harrison, this says you're a lifetime member. Must be some kind of grandfather clause. I don't recognize you." "I don't come in very often," Walt acknowledged. "Just once a month or so." Chad's eyes narrowed, behind his sunglasses. "Well, Mr. Harrison, we've implemented some new policies since the renovation. Shooters need to demonstrate basic proficiency before using the premium lanes. These are usually reserved for our more active members." There was no such policy. Chad had fabricated it on the spot, uncomfortable with the old man's unexpected skill and presence among the elite trainees and tactical shooters who populated the range that day. "I've been a member here for 23 years, Walt replied, his voice remaining level. "I wasn't aware of any changes to the membership terms." "Things change, old-timer," Chad said dismissively. "We need to maximize our resources for serious shooters, you understand." He gestured to the SEAL candidates. "These guys are training for real-world operations. They need the space." A few of the younger shooters nearby watched the exchange with uncomfortable expressions, but no one intervened. The SEAL instructor glanced over, his face impassive, before returning his attention to his trainees. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Walt looked at his target. 5 shots, all within a half-inch circle at 25 yards. Then back at Chad. "I believe my shooting demonstrates adequate proficiency," he said quietly. Chad snorted. "Lucky grouping. Listen, we've got a secondary range for recreational shooters, more appropriate for casual users. I can transfer your lane fee to that section." The secondary range was primarily used for beginners and featured limited distances and basic paper targets. Walt considered protesting further but recognized the futility. He had not come for confrontation. "I see," he said simply, beginning to pack his equipment with the same methodical care with which he had unpacked it. Chad stood watching, arms crossed, as if to ensure Walt's compliance. "Need any help there? Don't want you straining yourself," he offered, his tone making it clear the concern was not genuine. "I can manage," Walt replied, securing his pistols in their cases. As Walt gathered his belongings, one of the SEAL candidates, a young man named Ryan Keller, glanced over. Something about the old man's bearing, the way he handled his weapons, and the precision of his shooting had caught Ryan's attention. He watched as Walt carefully packed away the 1911, a model with which Ryan was very familiar from his training on historic military firearms. Chad, seeing that Walt was complying, returned to hovering near the SEAL instructor, eager to insert himself into the tactical conversation. Walt shouldered his range bag and began walking toward the exit, his steps measured, his back straight despite his years. As he passed behind the group of SEAL candidates, Ryan Keller turned for another look. His eyes fell upon something that made him freeze mid-movement, a small, almost imperceptible pin on the collar of Walt's windbreaker, briefly visible as the old man adjusted his bag. It was a trident, not the obvious, polished emblem many retired SEALs wore proudly, but an older, more subdued version that only someone intimately familiar with the history of naval special warfare would recognize. Ryan's breathing stopped, Momentarily, he nudged his teammate and whispered, "That's him." His fellow candidate looked confused. "Who?" Ryan's eyes never left Walt's retreating figure. "The Ghost. Walter Harrison, Saigon, Tehran, Panama." The names came out in reverent staccato. "He's supposed to be dead." By now, Walt had reached the door, pushing it open with one hand, his range bag clutched in the other. The afternoon. Sunlight illuminated his silhouette for a moment before he stepped through, disappearing from view. "Keller! Focus up!" The SEAL instructor's sharp command snapped Ryan back to attention, but his mind remained fixed on what he had just witnessed. Walt Harrison was indeed just a quiet old man who visited the shooting range once a month. He lived alone, kept to himself, and sought no recognition. But decades earlier, he had been something else entirely, a legend in the shadowy world of special operations, a man whose exploits were still studied in hushed classrooms at Naval Special Warfare Command, a ghost whose missions remained classified to this day. And now, due to a range supervisor's disrespect and a young SEAL candidate's sharp eye, his carefully maintained anonymity was about to unravel. Walt drove home in his modest sedan, unaware of the ripples his brief appearance had created. He followed his routine, weapons cleaned, stored securely, dinner at 5:30 p.m. sharp. As the evening settled around his small home, he sat in his favorite chair, a worn leather recliner that had molded itself to his form over the years. On the side table rested a single photograph in a simple frame. 5 men in nondescript military attire, their faces young and serious, standing before a helicopter with no identifying markings. Walt was the second from the left, his arm around the shoulders of a powerfully built man with intense eyes. Walt picked up the photograph, running his thumb gently over the faces. "Another month, brothers," he murmured, "still keeping the skills sharp." It was the closest thing to a prayer he allowed himself. Meanwhile, back at the range, Ryan Keller was experiencing something akin to religious fervor. The moment the training session ended, he pulled his fellow candidate aside. "Dude, I'm telling you, that was Walter Harrison, the Walter Harrison." His teammate James Wilson remained skeptical. "Come on, Keller, that guy's a myth. Half the stories they tell about him at training can't possibly be true. And if he is real, he'd be ancient by now." "He'd be in his late 70s, Ryan insisted. "The right age. And I saw his pin. The original UDT SEAL Trident. Not the commemorative ones, not the ones they sell in shops. The real deal, worn down, like it had been through hell and back." "Even if it was him, what's the big deal? Old SEAL comes to shoot. So what?" Ryan stared at his friend in disbelief. "So what? The man is a pioneer of modern special warfare. He was part of the original SEAL Team 2 in Vietnam. He led the extraction team in Operation Eagle Claw. He's credited with developing half the CQB tactics we're learning right now. And that jackass Chad just kicked him out like he was some senile old man who wandered in by mistake." James frowned, beginning to understand. "You sure about this? Because if you're right, that's seriously messed up." "I'm sure," Ryan said firmly. "My uncle served with naval special warfare in the 80s. He had a photo of Harrison in his study, called him the best operator who ever lived. I grew up staring at that picture. I'd know that face anywhere, even aged." Their conversation was interrupted by their instructor, Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Blackwood, a 16-year SEAL veteran with multiple combat deployments. "You two planning to camp out here all night? Or can we wrap this up?" Blackwood asked, his tone suggesting it wasn't really a question. Ryan straightened. "Senior Chief, permission to speak freely." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Granted, but make it quick, Keller. I've got paperwork waiting." "Sir." The elderly gentleman who was asked to leave earlier, I believe he was Walter Harrison. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Walter Harrison is dead, Keller. Has been for years. No, sir, with respect, that's the official story. But my uncle served with Naval Special Warfare Group 2. He knew Harrison, and that was him today, sir. I saw his original trident. Blackwood was silent for a long moment, studying Ryan's face. You're sure about this? Yes, sir. Absolutely sure. The senior chief's jaw tightened. And that range supervisor, Chad, he just showed him the door. Yes, sir. Said the main range was for serious shooters only. Blackwood's expression darkened. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Both of you, forget what you think. You saw today. That's an order. Dismissed. As Ryan and James left, Blackwood remained behind, pulling out his phone. He hesitated, then dialed a number from memory. Captain, it's Blackwood. We might have a situation. A candidate thinks he spotted Walter Harrison at the Atlantic Shores range today. He paused, listening. Yes, sir. That Walter Harrison. If it's true there was an incident. No, sir, not a security breach. Worse, disrespect. Walter Harrison slept fitfully that night, as he often did. His dreams were a kaleidoscope of jungle canopies, desert stars, and the faces of men, some who had returned home, many who had not. He awoke at precisely 500, a habit decades of military service had etched into his being, no alarm clock needed. His morning routine was unchanging. 20 push-ups and sit-ups, not as many as in his prime, but enough to keep the blood flowing, followed by a simple breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee. He sat at his kitchen table, newspaper spread before him, reading glasses perched on his nose, when a knock came at his door. Walt tensed. He rarely received visitors, especially at 7:13 a.m. Old instincts kicked in. He approached the door from an angle, keeping his body out of alignment with any potential line of fire through the entrance. "Who is it?" he called, his voice steady. "Walter Harrison. My name is Marcus Blackwood, Senior Chief, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. I was hoping to speak with you, sir." Walt hesitated, then opened the door. Before him stood a man in his early 40s with the compact, powerful build characteristic of special operators. He wore civilian clothes, jeans and a plain black t-shirt, but his bearing was unmistakably military. "How can I help you, Senior Chief?" Walt asked, neither confirming nor denying his identity. Blackwood met his gaze directly. "May I come in, sir? I believe we have some mutual acquaintances." Walt assessed the man for another moment, then stepped back, allowing him entry. He led Blackwood to the kitchen, offering coffee, which the younger man accepted with thanks. "So," Walt said, returning to his seat at the table, "what brings naval special warfare to my doorstep at this hour?" Blackwood set his coffee down. "Yesterday at Atlantic Shores Range, one of my candidates recognized you." Walt's expression remained neutral. "I'm just an old man who enjoys shooting, Senior Chief. With all due respect, sir, you're a bit more than that. Your groupings at 25 yards would be impressive for an operator in their prime, let alone a man of your experience." A ghost of a smile touched Walt's lips. "Age, you mean? You can say it, son. I'm old. The thing is, sir, according to official records, Walter Harrison died in a training accident in 1989. Walt took a slow sip of his coffee. "Records can be mistaken. Or deliberately altered," Blackwood countered. "For men whose continued existence might complicate matters of national security." For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Walt sighed, the sound of a man setting down a heavy burden after carrying it too long. "What do you want, Senior Chief?" "First, to apologize for how you were treated yesterday. That range supervisor had no right." Walt waved a dismissive hand. "I've been disrespected by better men than him. It's nothing. It's not nothing, sir. Not to the teams, not to those of us who know what the men of your generation sacrificed and accomplished." Blackwood leaned forward. "Which brings me to my second reason for being here. Captain James Harrington sends his regards." Walt's expression changed at the mention of the name, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. "Harrington, That young lieutenant from Panama? Not so young anymore, sir. He's the commanding officer of Special Warfare Group 2 now. Walt nodded slowly, memories surfacing behind his eyes. Good man, steady under pressure. He remembers what you taught him. Says it saved his life more times than he can count. Blackwood paused. Captain Harrington would like to speak with you if you're willing. There's a situation he thinks you might be able to help with. I've been out of the game a long time, Senior Chief. Some things don't change, sir, and some wisdom never goes out of date. Blackwood reached into his pocket and produced a business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. If you're interested, call this number. It's the captain's direct line. Walt took the card, studying it before placing it on the table. I'll think about it. Blackwood finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. One more thing, sir. That range supervisor, Chad Dennison, would you object if Captain Harrington had a word with the range owner about his conduct? Walt considered the question. The man was doing his job as he saw it. No, sir, he was being a bully because he could. That's not what we stand for. Blackwood's expression was earnest. The men and women who wear the trident today owe a debt to pioneers like you. We don't forget that. After Blackwood left, Walt returned to his kitchen, picking up the business card. He turned it over in his fingers several times, then placed it in his wallet. Whether he would call remained uncertain, even to him. Later that afternoon, Chad Dennison was surprised when his boss, the owner of Atlantic Shores shooting range, called him into the office. "Close the door, Chad," said Frank Ryerson, a retired Marine who had opened the range 15 years earlier. His expression was uncharacteristically serious. "Something wrong, Frank?" Chad asked, dropping into a chair. "I received some disturbing information about an incident yesterday involving an elderly shooter you redirected to the secondary range." Chad shrugged. "Just enforcing safety protocols. Guy was too old to be on the main range with the SEAL candidates." Frank's eyes narrowed. That guy was maintaining half-inch groups at 25 yards. Doesn't sound like a safety risk to me. "Beginners get lucky sometimes." "Do you know who Walter Harrison is?" Frank interrupted. Chad frowned. "Should I?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "Before my time in the Corps, there were men who laid the groundwork for modern special operations. Men who went places no one knew about did. Things no one talked about. Walter Harrison was one of those men." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that yesterday you disrespected a living legend in the special operations community. A man who has forgotten more about combat shooting than you'll ever know." Chad's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That old guy? Come on, Frank." Frank opened a drawer and pulled out a worn book, Men in Green Faces by Gene Wentz, a classic memoir of SEAL operations in Vietnam. He flipped to a dog-eared page where a group photo showed several intense-looking young men in jungle utilities. He pointed to one face. "That's Harrison, 1968. And this," he flipped to another page, showing a more formal military portrait, "is Harrison receiving the Navy Cross in 1971. One of 4 he earned, though most of his operations remain classified." Chad stared at the photos, the resemblance to the old man from yesterday unmistakable despite the decades between. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "That's the point, Chad. You didn't know, so you assumed. You judged a man based on his age rather than his actions. Even watching him shoot with remarkable precision, you chose to see an old man taking up space rather than a skilled marksman worthy of respect." Chad shifted uncomfortably. "What does this mean for my job?" "That depends on you," Frank said. "I've arranged something, and your participation will determine your future here." Meanwhile, at Naval Special Warfare Group 2 headquarters, Captain James Harrington was reviewing files when his phone rang. "Harrington." "Captain, it's Harrison." Harrington straightened in his chair. "Walt, I wasn't sure you'd call. Your senior chief made a compelling case, said you might need some help." "I do. We all do." Harrington paused. "There's a new SEAL qualification training class preparing for Hell Week. These candidates are technically proficient, but something's missing. The intangibles, the mindset that separates those who wear the trident from those who just want to. And you think an old warhorse like me has something to offer them?" "I know you do." Harrington's voice grew earnest. "Walt, these kids have grown up in a different world. Technology has changed everything, but the core of what we do, the spirit of it, that's timeless. No one embodies that better than you." There was a long silence on the line. "What exactly are you asking, Jim?" "Come speak to them. Not a formal lecture. Just talk. Share your experiences. Help them understand what it truly means to be a frogman." Another pause. "When?" "Tomorrow. Aero 900. I'll send a car." After ending the call, Walt sat in his leather recliner, lost in thought. Decades had passed since he'd spoken about his service to anyone outside the tight circle of his former teammates. The world had moved on. Tactics had evolved. Technology had transformed the battlefield. What could he possibly offer to young men and women preparing for a type of warfare so different from what he had known? His eyes drifted to the photograph on his side table, himself and 4 others standing before the unmarked helicopter. Only 2 of them had survived to old age, the debt he owed to those who hadn't weighed on him daily. Perhaps this was a way to honor that debt, to ensure their sacrifice continued to mean something in a world that had largely forgotten them. The following morning, a black SUV arrived precisely at 800. The driver, a young petty officer, opened the door for Walt. With evident reverence, "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Harrison," she said, as Walt settled into the passenger seat. "Just Walt is fine," he replied, somewhat uncomfortable with the deference. "Yes, sir, Walt," she corrected herself. "Captain Harrington briefed us. On your visit, word's gotten around base. Everyone's pretty excited." Walt raised an eyebrow. "Everyone?" The petty officer smiled. "The SEAL community is smaller than you might think. News travels fast, especially when it involves someone like you who was supposed to be dead." "Being dead had its advantages," Walt said dryly. "Peaceful." The drive to the base took them along the Virginia coastline. Walt watched the Atlantic waves breaking against the shore, remembering countless pre-dawn swims in waters far colder than these. At the gate, they were waved through immediately. The SUV proceeded to a nondescript building set back from the main complex. As they pulled up, Walt saw Captain Harrington waiting, now in his Navy uniform adorned with the SEAL trident and campaign ribbons that told their own story of service. Harrington approached as Walt exited the vehicle, extending his hand. "Walt, it's been too long. You've done well for yourself, Lieutenant," Walt said, deliberately using Harrington's old rank, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Learned from the best," Harrington replied, clasping Walt's hand firmly. "Thank you for coming. I can't overstate how important this is." Inside, they walked down a corridor lined with photographs documenting the history of naval special warfare, from the underwater demolition teams of World War II to modern SEAL operations. Walt paused occasionally, recognizing faces, operations, moments in time that had shaped the evolution of America's maritime special operations forces. "We've tried to preserve the history," Harrington explained, "to help the new generation understand. They're part of something larger than themselves." They stopped outside a classroom door. Inside, 24 SEAL candidates sat at attention, alongside several instructors, including Senior Chief Blackwood. Ryan Keller was among them, his eyes widening as Walt entered the room. Captain Harrington stepped to the front. "Gentlemen, today we have a rare privilege. Most of you have studied the history of naval special warfare, the operations that defined our community. Today, you have the opportunity to hear from someone who lived that history, who helped write it. He gestured to Walt. This is Walter Harrison, former Chief Petty Officer, SEAL Team 2. His service record includes Vietnam, Operations Eagle Claw, Urgent Fury, and Just Cause, among others that remain classified. He is the recipient of the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and numerous other decorations. He is also officially deceased, a status arranged to protect both him and national security after his final mission. The room was utterly silent, all eyes fixed on the unassuming elderly man who stood before them. Chief Harrison has agreed to speak with you today about what it truly means to be a SEAL. I expect you to listen carefully, because the wisdom he has to share may well make the difference between success and failure in the challenges that lie ahead for you. Harrington nodded to Walt, then stepped back. Walt surveyed the room slowly, taking in the eager, youthful faces before him. They looked so young, so much like the men he had served with decades ago, men who had lived and died in service to their country, their names now etched on memorials or, in some cases, forgotten by all but a few. "I'm not much for speeches," Walt began, his voice quiet but carrying a natural authority that commanded attention. "Never have been. In my day, we let our actions speak for us. But Captain Harrington seems to think you might benefit from hearing an old frogman ramble, so here we are." He moved to the front of the room, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, years seeming to fall away as he addressed them. "I see you looking at me, trying to reconcile the old man before you with the stories you've heard. Stories that, I suspect, have grown taller with each telling." A hint of amusement crossed his face. "Let me assure you, I was never 10 feet tall. I never killed an enemy with my bare hands while swimming across a river, and I certainly never performed surgery on myself with a combat knife and dental floss, despite what some of the more colorful accounts might suggest." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. "What I did do was my job, sometimes under difficult circumstances, always with the knowledge that the men beside me were doing the same, trusting me as I trusted them." Walt paused, gathering his thoughts. "You're training to join an elite community. You've already accomplished more than most by making it this far, but the hardest test isn't physical. It isn't how many push-ups you can do or how long you can hold your breath. It's who you are when everything goes wrong, when the plan fails, when your teammate is injured, when failure means not just your life, but the lives of hostages, civilians, fellow operators." His eyes moved across the room, making brief contact with each candidate. In those moments, technique matters, training matters, but what matters most is the core of who you are, your character, your ability to keep thinking, keep functioning, keep leading when every instinct is screaming at you to panic. Ryan Keller raised his hand hesitantly. Walt nodded to him. "Question? Sir, there's a story about an operation in Tehran. Is it true that you remained in hostile territory for 9 days after the primary extraction to recover the body of a fallen teammate?" Walt was silent for a long moment. "We don't leave our people behind, not even in death, especially not in death." The simple response carried more weight than any elaborate war story could have. Another candidate spoke up. "Chief Harrison, how did you deal with fear? Did it ever get easier?" "Anyone who says they aren't afraid in combat is either lying or psychotic," Walt replied. "Fear is normal, natural. The difference is in how you respond to it. You acknowledge it, then you put it aside and focus on the mission, on your training, on the man next to you. You don't have time for fear when you're responsible for others." For the next hour, Walt spoke candidly about his experiences, about the evolution of special operations, about the constants that remained despite changing technology and tactics. He avoided glamorizing combat or dwelling on the classified details of specific missions. Instead, he focused on the human elements: leadership, brotherhood, resilience, and the moral courage required to make difficult decisions under the most extreme circumstances. As the session concluded, Captain Harrington returned to the front of the room. "Chief Harrison has agreed to observe some of your training this afternoon. Consider it an opportunity to demonstrate that the standards which built this community's reputation continue to be upheld." The afternoon found Walt on the beach, watching as the candidates underwent physical training in the surf zone, push-ups in the sand, swimming in the cold Atlantic, boat crew races with the heavy inflatable. "Boat small," IBS held overhead. The instructors drove them relentlessly, their voices harsh and uncompromising. Senior Chief Blackwood stood beside Walt. "Different from your day?" Walt shook his head. "Same ocean, same sand, same purpose." He watched as a boat crew struggled, one member clearly faltering. "The fundamentals don't change. The body can achieve what the mind believes. That's what we try to instill in them," Blackwood agreed. "Most quit because they convince themselves they can't continue, not because they physically can't." As they observed, a commotion erupted among one of the boat crews. A candidate had collapsed, his teammates immediately surrounding him. The instructors moved in swiftly, assessing the situation. "Heat exhaustion," Blackwood explained tensely, "happens despite our precautions." Medical personnel rushed to the scene. The candidate was conscious but clearly in distress. His boat crew hovered nearby, uncertain and concerned. Walt watched not the fallen candidate, but his teammates. Their body language, their expressions, the way they looked to each other for guidance. In those unguarded moments, character revealed itself. One candidate in particular caught his attention: Ryan Keller. While others appeared uncertain, Keller had positioned himself between the sun and his fallen teammate, creating shade. A small gesture, instinctive rather than calculated. "That one," Walt said quietly to Blackwood, nodding toward Keller. "He thinks beyond himself." Blackwood nodded. "Keller, one of our strongest candidates physically, been concerned about his leadership qualities, though, tends to be a lone wolf. Yes, sometimes the best leaders don't realize they're leading until others start following," Walt observed. As the day progressed, Walt found himself increasingly invested in the training he was observing. These young men were the future of a community he had helped build. Their success or failure would determine whether the standards and values he had lived by would continue to shape American special operations. During a brief break, Captain Harrington approached Walt. "There's someone else who'd like to speak. With you, if you're willing. The range supervisor from yesterday, Chad Dennison. He's here at my invitation." Walt raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "I believe in accountability," Harrington said simply, "and in the opportunity for correction." Walt considered this, then nodded. "Where is he?" Chad Dennison waited nervously in a small conference room, standing at attention when Walt entered, though the older man wore no uniform and carried no official rank. "Mr. Harrison," Chad began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, "I want to apologize for my behavior yesterday. I was disrespectful and judgmental. I made assumptions based on your age rather than recognizing your skill and experience." Walt studied the younger man, seeing beyond the bravado to the insecurity beneath. "Apology accepted, Mr. Dennison. We all make mistakes." "It's more than a mistake, sir. It was a failure of character on my part." Chad hesitated. "I've since learned who you are, what you've done for our country. I'm ashamed of how I treated you." "Knowledge doesn't change the principle," Walt replied evenly. "You should treat every person with the same respect, regardless of who they are or what they've done. A man's worth isn't measured by his accolades or reputation. Chad nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. I understand that now, sir. I just wanted you to know that I'm taking steps to change my approach. Mr. Ryerson, the range owner, has offered me a choice: improve my attitude or find another job. And what have you decided? I want to stay. I want to do better. Chad's expression was earnest. I love that range, sir. I love helping people become better, safer shooters. I just lost sight of what that really means. Walt considered the man before him. There was sincerity in his remorse, a genuine desire for redemption. Everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Dennison. The question is what you'll do with yours. As Walt prepared to leave the base later that afternoon, Ryan Keller approached him, having received permission from his instructors for a brief word. Chief Harrison, he said, standing at attention, I just wanted to thank you for speaking with us today. Walt gestured for him to relax. At ease, Keller. I understand you're the one who recognized me at the range. Ryan nodded. Yes, sir. My uncle served in Group 2 in the 80s. He spoke of you often, said you were the standard by which all operators should measure themselves. Your uncle exaggerates, Walt said dryly. What's his name? Michael Keller, sir. He was a hospital corpsman with SEAL Team 4. Recognition flashed in Walt's eyes. Doc Keller, good man, steady hands under pressure. He saved a teammate of mine in Panama. Ryan's face lit up. He never told me that story. Some stories stay with us too, painful or precious to share, Walt replied. But tell him Walt Harrison remembers. He'll know what it means. As they parted ways, Captain Harrington walked Walt to the waiting SUV. Thank you for today, Harrington said sincerely. You've given these candidates something no training manual or simulation could provide, perspective from someone who's walked the path before them. Walt nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of his years. They're good kids, Jim. Different world from ours, but the same heart. That's what matters. In the end, Harrington agreed. He hesitated, then continued, I have a proposition for you. Nothing formal, nothing that would interfere with your retirement, but an opportunity to maintain a connection with the community, to share your experience with new generations of operators. Walt listened as Harrington outlined his idea. Occasional visits to speak with candidates, participation in select training events, a living link to the history and traditions that defined naval special warfare. I'll think about it, Walt promised as he prepared to depart. Driving away from the base, Walt felt a strange mixture of emotions, nostalgia for the brotherhood he had once been part of, satisfaction in seeing that brotherhood continued in capable hands, and perhaps for the first time in many years, a sense of purpose beyond his quiet, solitary existence. The petty officer driving him home glanced over. Good day, sir. Walt looked out at the ocean passing by the window, the same ocean that had tested him, shaped him, nearly claimed him more than once. Yes, he said simply, a good day. The next morning, Walt awoke to an unfamiliar sensation, anticipation. For years, his days had blended together in comfortable monotony, the routine a shield against memories that could still ambush him, in unguarded moments. But today felt different. Captain Harrington's proposition had stirred something long dormant. He performed his morning exercises with unusual vigor, adding an extra set of push-ups. After breakfast, he found himself opening the closet door and reaching for a cardboard box on the top shelf, a container untouched for nearly a decade. Inside lay mementos of another life, a faded green beret, challenge coins from various units, a combat diver qualification badge tarnished with age. Beneath these, wrapped in soft cloth, rested a small wooden case. Walt lifted it carefully, setting it on his bed before opening it. The Navy cross gleamed dully in the morning light, its patina speaking of years rather than regular polishing. Walt had never been one to display his decorations. They belonged to a life he had left behind, honors earned through actions he preferred not to dwell upon. Yet today he found himself studying the medal, remembering the mission that had earned it. Laos, 1970. An extraction gone wrong. 3 days of evasion through jungle so dense it turned daylight to perpetual dusk. Carrying a wounded teammate on a makeshift stretcher. The ambush at the river crossing. The terrible choices made in desperate moments. The citation had used words like extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety. Walt remembered it differently, as fear managed, training. Followed, promises kept. Nothing extraordinary, just necessity. His reverie was interrupted by the telephone ringing. Few people had his number. "Harrison," he answered. "Walt, it's Frank Ryerson from Atlantic Shores Range." The voice was friendly but slightly hesitant. "Hope I'm not calling too early." "I've been up for hours," Walt assured him. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ryerson?" "Please, call me Frank. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened at the range. Chad told me he spoke with you yesterday." "Water under the bridge," Walt replied. "That's generous of you, but I'd like to make it right." Frank paused. "We're hosting a special event this weekend, a shooting clinic for veterans. Nothing fancy, just basics for those who might be rusty or never received proper instruction. We have a few former competitive shooters volunteering as instructors, but having someone with your experience there would be invaluable. Not to instruct necessarily, unless you wanted to, just to be present. Talk with the vets, share stories, create that sense of continuity between generations." Walt considered the request. 2 social engagements in as many days, after years of near isolation. The thought should have been overwhelming, yet somehow it wasn't. "What time?" he asked finally. "So 900 Saturday. I'll reserve your usual lane for before and after if you'd like some personal range time." "I'll be there," Walt promised. After ending the call, Walt returned to the wooden box containing his Navy Cross. With deliberate movements, he closed it and returned it to its place in the cardboard box. But instead of putting the box back on the shelf, he removed one more item. A small, tarnished metal trident, the original design worn by the earliest SEAL teams. The same pin Ryan Keller had spotted at the range. Walt placed it on his dresser, a silent acknowledgement of a part of himself he had kept hidden for too long. The next morning brought another surprise. A hand-delivered letter with no return address, just his name written in a precise, angular script he recognized immediately. Inside was a single sheet of high-quality stationery and a brief message. "Walt, heard you've resurfaced, long overdue. Dinner at Blackwell's, 1900 hours Friday, non-negotiable. Martin." Despite himself, Walt smiled. Martin Blackwell had been his executive officer in SEAL Team 2, later commanding SEAL Team 6 in its early days before retiring as a captain. He was also the most stubborn, demanding officer Walt had ever served under, and one of the few people Walt considered a true friend. Blackwell's was a small, elegant restaurant in downtown Norfolk, frequented by senior naval officers from the nearby base. Walt hadn't been there in years, had almost forgotten its existence. The idea of dining in such a public place made him vaguely uncomfortable, yet Martin's non-negotiable was familiar territory. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Friday evening found Walt dressed in his one good suit, charcoal grey, conservatively. Cut purchased years ago for a teammate's funeral. He arrived at Blackwell's precisely at 1855, a lifetime of military punctuality impossible to abandon. The maitre d' greeted him with professional courtesy. "Mr. Harrison, Captain Blackwell is already seated. Please follow me." Walt was led to a private dining room at the back of the restaurant. As the door opened, he was met not by one aging former SEAL, but by 5. Martin Blackwell rose from his seat, still ramrod straight, despite his 70-plus years. Silver hair cropped in a military short style. "About damn time you rejoined the living, Chief," he said, extending his hand. Beside him stood Thomas "Doc" Reeves, former Special Operations combat medic, now a renowned trauma surgeon; Richard Alvarez, who had gone on to a distinguished career in the CIA after leaving the teams; James Wu, who had pioneered advances in tactical diving equipment; and Samuel "Preacher" Wilson, who had served as Command Master Chief of Naval Special Warfare before retirement. They were older, grayer, some thicker around the middle, others leaner with age, but their eyes held the same intensity, the same recognition of shared experience that transcended time. "What is this?" Walt asked, momentarily overwhelmed. "Reunions are for units with dress uniforms and marching bands," Martin replied. "This is just dinner with some old frogs who thought you were dead." Doc Reeves approached, his assessment of Walt clinical despite the emotional context. "You look good for a corpse, Walt. Keeping active?" "Active enough," Walt replied, finding his equilibrium. "Though I apparently need to update my PERSEC if you all found me this easily." "Blame Harrington," James Wu said with a chuckle. "Man couldn't keep his mouth shut. Called me yesterday, excited as a boot, who just passed Budess. Guess who's alive and giving pep talks to the candidates?" "It wasn't a pep talk," Walt muttered, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Preacher Wilson, whose nickname stemmed not from religiosity, but from his tendency to deliver impromptu lectures on battlefield ethics, clasped Walt's shoulder. "Glad you're back among the living, brother. The community needs its elders, especially now." "I'm no elder," Walt protested. "Just an old operator who stayed too long in the shadows." "That's precisely what an elder is," Preacher countered. "Someone who carries the wisdom of experience, but has stepped back from the fight. The tribal memory, Walt. That's what you are. What we all are now." As they settled around the table, the conversation flowed with the ease of men who had once trusted each other with their lives. They spoke of operations now declassified, of teammates long gone, of the evolution of the community they had helped build. "You should see the new gear," Richard Alvarez commented as the main course arrived. "Makes what we had look like something from the Stone Age." "Gear doesn't make the operator," Walt replied automatically. "Said every dinosaur throughout history," Martin countered with a grin. "But you're right, of course. These kids today, they're technically proficient, physically superior to what we were, if we're being honest, but something's missing." "Perspective," Preacher offered. "The understanding that technology fails, plans disintegrate. When everything goes wrong, it's the human element that determines success or failure." Walt nodded, thinking of Ryan Keller providing shade for his fallen teammate. A simple act of awareness and compassion amid chaos. "They can learn, if we teach them." "That's why we're here," Martin said, his tone growing serious. "Not just for a reunion, pleasant as that is. We've been discussing a more formal program. A way to connect the generations, to ensure the lessons we learned through blood and sacrifice aren't lost." "What kind of program?" Walt asked cautiously. Doc Reeves leaned forward. "Nothing bureaucratic, nothing that requires uniforms or paperwork, just a commitment from those of us still standing to make ourselves available, to speak with the candidates, the new operators, to share not just tactics and techniques, but the intangibles, the mindset, the ethics. The why behind the how," James Wu added. "Harrington's on board," Martin continued. "So are commanders from all the SEAL teams. They'll provide the access, the opportunities. We provide the wisdom, such as it is." Walt looked around the table, seeing the earnestness in his old comrades' expressions. "Why now?" "Because we're running out of time," Preacher said bluntly. "Our generation is fading. The institutional knowledge, the hard-won lessons, they'll die with us if we don't pass them on." "And because the world hasn't gotten any simpler," Richard added. "These kids are facing challenges we never imagined, technologies we never dreamed of. The fundamentals matter more than ever." Walt was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he raised his glass. To passing it on, then, while we still can. 5 glasses met his in the center of the table, a pledge renewed among men who had already given more than most would ever know. As dinner concluded, Martin pulled Walt aside. There's something else you should know, something we've been working on for years. He produced a slim folder from his briefcase and handed it to Walt. Inside were photographs, children, teenagers, young adults, some in graduation gowns, others in military uniforms, a few in medical scrubs or business attire. Who are they? Walt asked, though something in his heart already knew. The children of our fallen, Martin said quietly. We've been tracking them, supporting them quietly. College scholarships, mentorship, career guidance, making sure the promise we made hasn't been forgotten. The promise, spoken or unspoken, it existed between all who served in the teams. If I don't make it, back, look after my family. Walt's throat tightened as he recognized last names: Johnson, Ramirez, Patterson, sons and daughters of men he had served with, men who hadn't come home. The youngest is 17 now, Martin continued. Michael Patterson's boy. Wants to follow his father's footsteps. Apply to the academy. Michael Patterson. The image flashed unbidden in Walt's mind. A young lieutenant, brilliant tactician, killed in the same operation that had led to Walt's official death and subsequent disappearance from public life. The mission that still haunted his dreams. You've been doing this all along, Walt said, a statement rather than a question. Martin nodded. Someone had to, and now we could use your help. These kids, they've grown up with myths, not memories, stories about their fathers, sanitized and incomplete. They deserve to know the men their fathers really were, not just the heroics, but the humanity. Walt closed the folder carefully, as if it contained fragile treasures. I'll do what I can. The following morning, Walt arrived at Atlantic Shores, shooting range precisely at 0845. Frank Ryerson greeted him at the entrance, his handshake firm, his manner respectful without being obsequious. Thank you for coming, Chief Harrison. It means a lot. Walt noted the use of his former rank. Word had spread quickly. Just Walt is fine. Frank led him into the main range area, where about 20 veterans of various ages had gathered. Some were clearly recent service members, their posture and haircuts giving them away. Others were older, Vietnam era, a few perhaps even from Korea. They chatted in small groups, the camaraderie of shared experience evident despite their diverse backgrounds. Chad Dennison was there as well, notably subdued as he prepared target stands and safety equipment. He nodded respectfully to Walt, but maintained his distance, still processing their previous encounters. We'll be rotating through 3 stations, Frank explained. Handgun fundamentals at the main range, rifle basics at the long range, and a classroom session on firearms safety and maintenance. Nothing elaborate, just a refresher for those who might be rusty. Walt nodded. Where do you want me? Wherever. You're comfortable, Frank replied. Some of the older vets might particularly appreciate time with someone from their era, but it's entirely up to you. As the event began, Walt found himself gravitating toward the classroom setting, not to instruct but to listen. He sat quietly at the back as a former Marine Corps shooting team member walked the group through basic firearms maintenance, interjecting occasionally with practical tips learned through hard experience. During a break, an older veteran with a Korean War veteran's cap approached Walt. You're Harrison, aren't you? The SEAL. Walt nodded, extending his hand. Walt Harrison. Jim Michaels, 2nd Infantry Division, Korea. The man's grip was still strong despite his advanced years. Heard some stories about you from the young guys. Impressive career. Walt shrugged modestly. Just did my job, like we all did. Jim chuckled. That's what we all say, isn't it? Just doing my job makes it easier somehow. He glanced around at the younger veterans, mingling nearby. These kids, though, they're facing something different. Coming home to a nation that sends them off with parades but doesn't know what to do with them when they return broken. Walt followed his gaze, noting the subtle signs of struggle in some of the younger veterans, a 1,000-yard stare here, an unconscious hypervigilance there. Different war, same wounds, he observed quietly. That's why events like this matter, Jim said, not just for the shooting, for this. He gestured to two veterans deep in conversation. The understanding, the belonging. Hardest thing about coming home is feeling like no one gets it. Throughout the day, Walt moved between stations, sometimes participating, sometimes observing, always available for quiet conversations with veterans who sought him out. He didn't tell war stories or highlight his accomplishments. Instead, he listened to concerns about VA benefits, to struggles with civilian employment, to the challenges of explaining to loved ones what couldn't be put into words. During the handgun session, he noticed a young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, struggling with her stance. Her frustration was evident as her shots consistently went wide of the target. The instructor was occupied with another veteran, so Walt approached cautiously. "Mind if I make a suggestion?" he asked. She turned, assessing him briefly before nodding. "Please, I'm embarrassing myself here." "No such thing," Walt assured her. "Just learning opportunities." He demonstrated a slight modification to her grip. "Try rolling your support hand thumb down a bit. Gives you more control over recoil." She adjusted her grip, fired again, and hit closer to center. A smile flashed across her face. "Better. Thanks." "You serve?" Walt asked conversationally as she prepared for another shot. "2 tours, Afghanistan, combat medic." She fired again, the grouping tightening. "You? Navy, special operations. Long time ago." She paused, studying him more carefully. "Wait. Are you Walt Harrison?" Walt blinked in surprise. "Yes." "Holy shit." She immediately looked embarrassed at her outburst. "Sorry, it's just my father served with Team 2 in the 80s. He told me stories about you, said you were the best combat swimmer in the teams." "Your father exaggerated," Walt said automatically. "What's his name?" "David Collins. He was a quartermaster." Walt's expression softened with recognition. "Dave Collins. Good man. Saved our bacon in Grenada with that resupply drop." He paused. "How is he?" Her face fell slightly. "He passed. 3 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry," Walt said sincerely. "He was one of the good ones." "He was," she agreed. "And he'd be freaking out right now if he knew I was getting shooting tips from Walt Harrison." She smiled, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah, by the way. Sarah Collins Martinez." "Honored to meet you, Sarah." Walt gestured to her target. "Your dad would be proud, not just of your shooting, but of your service." As the event continued, Walt found himself increasingly engaged, increasingly present in a way he hadn't been in years. The isolation that had defined his retirement, initially a security measure, later a habit, seemed less necessary, less desirable than it once had. Near the end of the day, Chad Dennison approached Walt during a quiet moment. His demeanor was markedly different from their first encounter, respectful but not fawning, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Mr. Harrison, Walt, I wanted to thank you for coming today," he said. "The veterans really appreciate it, especially having someone like you take time to work with them." "We're all just shooters here," Walt replied. "Some with more experience than others." Chad nodded, understanding the subtle lesson. "I've been thinking a lot about our first meeting, about how quick I was to judge based on appearance." He hesitated. "I've done that too often. Making assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. Awareness is the first step to change," Walt observed. "I'd like to make it right, Beyond just apologizing, Chad continued, Frank and I have been discussing a new program. Free range. Time for veterans, especially older vets who might be on fixed incomes. A way to create space for them to maintain skills and connect with others who understand their experiences. Walt considered this. Sounds worthwhile. Would you be willing to advise us? Help us structure it in a way that would actually serve veterans' needs, not just make us feel good about ourselves. The question was sincere, the humility genuine. Walt recognized in Chad something he had seen in countless young operators. Over the years, the capacity for growth, for transformation when properly guided. I think I could do that, Walt agreed. As the event wound down, Frank gathered everyone for a group photograph, a visual record of bridges built between generations of veterans. Walt initially tried to position himself at the edge of the frame, his lifelong habit of avoiding documentation asserting itself. But the other veterans wouldn't have it, insisting he take a place in the center, a reluctant elder statesman among his tribe. Driving home that evening, Walt felt a peculiar lightness. The weight of isolation, of disconnection that had been his constant companion for decades, seemed less oppressive. The memories that had haunted him, of missions gone wrong, of teammates lost, of the moral compromises demanded by war, were still there, but somehow balanced now by new connections, by the recognition that his experience, even the painful parts, held value for others. He thought of Sarah Collins Martinez, carrying on her father's legacy of service, of Ryan Keller, preparing to write his own chapter in the SEAL tradition, of the children in Martin's folder, growing up without their fathers, but not without the community their fathers had been part of. At a stoplight, Walt caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. An old man, certainly, but not merely a relic of the past. Perhaps instead a living link between what had been and what could be, a bridge spanning generations of service and sacrifice. The light turned green. Walt drove on toward home, but also toward something new, a purpose he had not anticipated but now welcomed. The quiet old man from the shooting range had been recognized, not just for who he had been, but for who he still was. And in that recognition, he had found an unexpected path forward. As Walt pulled into his driveway, his phone rang. Captain Harrington, with news about an upcoming Bud-S graduation ceremony and a request for Walt's presence on the reviewing stand. Without hesitation, Walt accepted. The solitary chapter of his life was ending. A new one, unexpected but welcome, was beginning, and somewhere he thought his old teammates would approve. 6 months later, Walt Harrison stood at the edge of the surf, watching as exhausted Buds candidates struggled through a punishing series of flutter kicks in the frigid Pacific water. The infamous Hell Week was in its 4th day, and the young men before him had been pushed beyond what most civilians would consider humanly possible. Operating on fewer than 4 hours of sleep since Monday, their bodies chafed raw from wet sand, their minds clouded by exhaustion so profound it bordered on hallucination. Walt had seen it before, had lived it himself decades earlier on these same beaches. What struck him now was not how much had changed, but how much remained the same. The fundamental crucible designed to reveal character under extreme duress. That was timeless. "What do you see?" asked Master Chief Peterson, the senior enlisted instructor for this Bud-S class, who had joined Walt for this morning's evolution. Walt watched as one candidate, barely able to lift his arms, nonetheless reached over to help a teammate maintain the proper position during the exercise. "I see future teammates," he replied, "the ones who understand it's not about individual survival." Peterson nodded. "That's Ramirez. Been helping others all week even though he's hurting bad himself. Broken toe, we think, though he hasn't said a word about it." "He'll make it," Walt said with quiet certainty. "Because he's tough? Because he's found the real secret." Walt gestured toward the struggling candidates. "The ones who make it aren't always the strongest or the fastest. They're the ones who discover that helping your teammates somehow gives you the strength to keep going yourself. And Dick, in the months since his re-emergence into the SEAL community, Walt had become a regular presence at naval special warfare training facilities. Not as an instructor. He had no interest in giving tactical lessons on techniques that had evolved significantly since his day. Rather, he served as what Captain Harrington had taken to calling a wisdom keeper, sharing the intangible aspects of special operations that transcended specific eras or technologies. What had begun as occasional talks to candidates had evolved into a more structured program, now nicknamed the Trident Legacy Project. Walter Harrison, once officially deceased, had become its reluctant cornerstone. "You're headed to the graduation ceremony tomorrow?" Peterson asked as they turned. "To walk back toward the compound," Walt nodded. "Wouldn't miss it. Ryan Keller is in this class." "Solid operator," Peterson acknowledged. "He credits you with helping him get through the tough spots. Says whenever he thought about quitting, he'd remember your stories about Vietnam. About Iran made his challenges seem manageable by comparison." "Good," Walt said simply. "That's how it should work. Each generation standing on the shoulders of the last." Back at his hotel that evening, Walt laid out his outfit for the following day's ceremony. Not his old uniform, which no longer fit his older frame, but a simple dark suit with a single embellishment, his original SEAL Trident pin, now mounted on a small lapel pin. After decades in a box, it would be displayed with quiet pride. His phone rang. Martin Blackwell calling with a reminder about their monthly dinner with the other elders, as they had come to call themselves. "I'll be there," Walt assured him. "Wouldn't dare miss it and face your wrath." Martin chuckled. "Damn right! Oh, and Walt, the Patterson boy got his acceptance to Annapolis yesterday. His mother called me in tears." Walt felt a surge of satisfaction. Michael Patterson's son would have his chance to follow in his father's footsteps, supported by the brotherhood his father had died serving. Good news. He'll make Michael proud. "Already has," Martin replied. "And speaking of making people proud, I hear you're giving the commencement address at the Bud S. graduation tomorrow. Never thought I'd see the day when Walter Harrison voluntarily stood up to give a speech." Walt grimaced. "Neither did I. Harrington can be persuasive. It's not Harrington's persuasiveness, it's you finally accepting that your words matter, that your experience has value beyond the operations themselves." And after ending the call, Walt sat at the small desk in his hotel room, reviewing the notes for his address. Public speaking had never been his forte. In the teams, he had been a man of action rather than words, letting his performance speak for itself. But tomorrow, he would stand before newly minted SEALs, their families, and naval special warfare leadership to articulate what it truly meant to wear the trident. The thought was daunting, yet as Walt reviewed his handwritten notes, he realized that the nervousness he felt was overshadowed by something stronger, a sense of responsibility to those who hadn't lived to see their legacy continued, and to those just beginning their journey in special operations. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the Pacific Ocean a glittering backdrop to the ceremony. Rows of chairs had been arranged on the parade ground, filled with proud family members, Naval Special Warfare Command leadership, and special guests. At the front sat the graduating class, their faces showing the peculiar mix of exhaustion and elation that came from completing one of the military's most demanding training programs. Walt took his place on the reviewing stand alongside Captain Harrington and other dignitaries. From this vantage point, he could see Ryan Keller seated among his classmates, his posture perfect despite the rigors of the past months. Their eyes met briefly, mutual respect passing between them. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. The presentation of colors, the national anthem, remarks from the commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center. Then Captain Harrington stepped to the podium, Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce our commencement speaker. Many of you may not recognize his name, as much of his service remains classified even decades later. But within the naval special warfare community, Walter Harrison is a legend, not for seeking glory, but for embodying the quiet professionalism that defines our ethos. Harrington detailed a sanitized version of Walt's career, his early days with SEAL Team 2 in Vietnam, his contributions to evolving special operations tactics, his mentorship of countless operators who would go on to distinguished careers of their own. He tactfully omitted the circumstances of Walt's supposed death and decades of seclusion, focusing instead on his recent contributions to the Trident Legacy Project. It is my privilege to present Chief Petty Officer Walter Harrison, United States Navy, retired. Walt approached the podium amid respectful applause. He looked out over the audience, momentarily transported back to his own graduation decades earlier. The faces before him blurred with those from his past. Teammates who had stood beside him in moments of triumph and tragedy, men who had given everything in service to their country. He unfolded his notes, then deliberately set them aside. The words he needed wouldn't be found on paper. To the graduating class of Buds Class 347, congratulations. What you have accomplished is extraordinary by any standard. You have proven yourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally capable of meeting challenges few will ever understand, much less overcome. Walt paused, his gaze moving across the new SEALs. But today marks not an end, but a beginning. The Trident you will receive shortly is not a trophy for what you have endured, but a promise of what you will give. It represents a standard you must uphold every day for the rest of your lives, whether you serve 4 years or 40, whether in combat or civilian life. He spoke without grandiloquence, his words simple but carrying the weight of lived experience. In the teams, you will write your own stories. Some will be tales of daring operations that change the course of conflicts. Others will be quieter narratives of preparation, of training, of readiness for moments that may never come. All are part of the legacy you now join. Walt glanced toward the family section, where parents, spouses, children, and friends watched. With pride and perhaps a touch of apprehension. To the families, I offer both congratulations and thanks. The operators before you could not do what they do without your support, your understanding, your willingness to bear burdens often unseen and unacknowledged. You too are part of this community now. Returning his attention to the graduates, Walt continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. When I stood where you sit now, I could not have imagined the path that lay ahead. The jungles of Vietnam, the mountains of Iran, the streets of Panama, places I cannot name, for operations that remain in shadow. Through it all, what sustained me wasn't specialized training or advanced equipment, though both have their place. It was the men beside me, the unwavering knowledge that they would give everything, as I would for them, to complete the mission and bring each other home. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. You will face moments of extreme challenge, where the correct path is unclear, where the stakes are life and death. In those moments, remember your training, yes, but more importantly, remember who you are and what the Trident demands of those who wear it. Courage, honor, commitment, not as abstract concepts, but as daily choices. Walt's eyes found Ryan Keller in the front row, seeing in the young man's expression the same mixture of determination and idealism he had once felt himself. The world you will operate in is different from mine. Technology has transformed the battlefield. Political realities have evolved. But the core of what you do, what we do, remains unchanged. At its heart, special operations has always been about extraordinary individuals coming together to accomplish the seemingly impossible. through teamwork, innovation, and sheer force of will. Walt stepped back slightly from the podium, standing straighter, his voice strengthening. There will be failures, missions that don't go as planned, days when you question whether the sacrifice is worth it. In those moments, look to your teammates. Look to those who walked this path before you. Remember that you are part of something larger than yourself, a tradition of service that spans generations. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a tarnished piece of metal, his original swim buddy tag from Bud S, still bearing his name and service number. I've carried this for over 50 years, through every operation, every deployment, every triumph and tragedy, not as a good luck charm, but as a reminder of where I came from and what was expected of me. Find your own reminders, create your own traditions, but never forget the foundation upon which you stand. Walt looked out at the audience one final time, his expression solemn yet proud. The trident is now yours to uphold. Wear it with humility. Honor it with your actions. Pass on what you learn to those who will follow. This is not just your achievement, it is your responsibility. With that, Walt stepped away from the podium to resounding applause. As he returned to his seat, Captain Harrington leaned over. "Not bad for someone who claims to dislike public speaking," he murmured. Walt shrugged slightly. "Just speaking truth as I see it." The ceremony continued with the presentation of the tridents, the iconic gold pin that would transform these graduates from candidates to full-fledged SEALs. Walt watched with particular attention as Ryan Keller received his, the young man's, face solemn with the weight of the moment. Following the ceremony, a reception was held where families could celebrate with their newly pinned SEALs. Walt stood somewhat apart, uncomfortable as always with crowds, when he noticed a commotion near the entrance to the pavilion. A wheelchair was being guided in by a middle-aged woman. In it sat an elderly man in a dress blue uniform adorned with combat ribbons from an earlier era. Despite his obvious physical frailty, his eyes were sharp, taking in the scene with keen interest. Captain Harrington approached Walt, nodding toward the newcomer. "Chief Gardner served with Underwater Demolition Team 11 in Korea, then helped establish the early SEAL teams. One of the original Plankowners, his grandson, is in today's graduating class." Walt watched as the young SEAL, presumably Gardner's grandson, knelt beside the wheelchair, his newly pinned trident gleaming on his uniform. The contrast was striking: youth and age, vitality and frailty, yet connected by the golden emblem they both wore. "You should go talk to him," Harrington suggested. "Not many of his generation left." Walt hesitated, then nodded. He approached the wheelchair, waiting until the family had finished taking photographs before stepping forward. "Chief Gardner, Walt Harrison, SEAL Team 2. The older man looked up, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Harrison, heard stories about you back in the day. Vietnam, wasn't it?" "Among other places," Walt acknowledged, extending his hand. Gardner's grip was still firm despite his age. "Good to meet you, Harrison. These youngsters treating the old ways with respect?" "They are," Walt assured him. "Different tools, same spirit. That's what matters." Gardner gestured to his grandson, who stood nearby. "Tommy here. He's fourth-generation military, second-generation frogman, carrying on the tradition." The young SEAL stepped forward to shake Walt's hand, his expression reverent. "It's an honor, Chief Harrison. My grandfather told me about the early days, how you all built the foundations of what we do now." Walt nodded toward the elder Gardner. "Your grandfather and his generation were the real pioneers. We just built on what they started." As they continued talking, Walt was struck by the living continuum before him. From UDT to modern SEAL, a direct line of operational heritage spanning more than 70 years. Gardner had swum reconnaissance for beach landings in Korea. His grandson would operate with technology unimaginable in Gardner's day. Yet they were bound by the same ethos, the same commitment to excellence under the most demanding conditions. Later, as the reception was winding down, Ryan Keller approached Walt, now accompanied by his parents and uncle, Michael "Doc" Keller, the former SEAL Team 4 corpsman Walt had recognized by name. "Chief Harrison," Ryan said formally, "I wanted to introduce you to my family." Walt shook hands with Ryan's parents, then turned to his uncle. "Doc Keller, been a long time." Michael Keller grinned, the years falling away. "Too long, Chief. Thought you were dead until this knucklehead spotted you at the range." He clapped his nephew on the shoulder. "Seems to be the recurring theme lately," Walt replied dryly. "Your speech today," Ryan's mother said. "It meant a lot to us. Helps us understand what Ryan is becoming part of." "It's a good community," Walt assured her. "They'll take care of him." "Like they took care of you?" she asked, a mother's concern evident. Walt considered the question carefully. "In all the ways that matter, yes. The teams look after their own, during service and long after." Ryan stood straighter, his new trident catching the light. "Chief Harrison has agreed to be my mentor through the Trident Legacy program. I'll be checking in with him regularly as I begin my operational career." The mentorship program had been Martin Blackwell's idea, pairing newly minted SEALs with veterans who could provide guidance beyond what their direct chain of command might offer. Walt had initially resisted taking on a formal role, but Ryan's persistent request had eventually worn him down. "Just remember," Walt told Ryan, "my advice comes with a caveat. The world you're entering isn't the one I left. Take what's useful, leave what isn't." "Wisdom is wisdom," Ryan replied confidently. "The fundamentals don't change." As the Keller family moved on to greet others, Walt found himself momentarily alone. He looked around at the mingling crowd. New SEALs with their futures before them, families attempting to understand the world their loved ones were entering, veterans of different eras sharing stories and advice. A hand fell on his shoulder. Captain Harrington. "Quite a day," the captain observed, "from the quiet old man at the range to commencement speaker at Bud-S graduation in 6 months. Quite a journey." Walt shook his head slightly. "Not my doing. I was perfectly content with my solitude." "Were you?" Harrington asked pointedly, "or was it just easier than facing the memories, the losses?" Walt didn't answer immediately, reflecting on the months since Ryan Keller had recognized him, the Trident Legacy Project, the veteran support program at Atlantic Shores Range, now flourishing under his occasional guidance, the monthly dinners with Martin and the other elders. The letters he had begun writing to the children of fallen teammates, sharing stories of their fathers that official records would never capture. Perhaps not content, he acknowledged finally. Resigned, maybe. And now? Walt watched as Chief Gardner's grandson helped the elderly UDT veteran back into his wheelchair, the bond between them transcending the decades that separated their service. "Now I understand that isolation isn't the answer. That part of honoring those we lost is ensuring their legacy continues." Harrington nodded. "That's what this is all about, isn't it? Not just preparing the next generation tactically, but connecting them to the heritage they're becoming part of, helping them understand the weight of the trident they'll wear." The next morning, Walt returned to the Bud-S compound one last time before heading home. The beach was empty now, the torture of Hell Week temporarily suspended until the next. Class reached that milestone. He walked along the water's edge, memories washing over him like the gentle waves at his feet, his first day of training on this same stretch of sand. The instructors who had seemed like gods, capable of inflicting suffering beyond imagination. The moment when he had nearly quit, convinced he had reached his absolute limit, only to find reserves of strength he hadn't known existed. The teammates who had pulled him through, some of whom never returned from distant battlefields. As he walked, Walt noticed a solitary figure sitting on the sand near the obstacle course, an instructor, judging by the uniform, staring out at the ocean in apparent contemplation. Drawing closer, Walt recognized Senior Chief Peterson. The instructor acknowledged him with a nod. "Early morning reflection?" Walt asked, stopping beside him. "Something like that," Peterson replied. "Just thinking about the next class. They arrive on Monday." "And it begins again," Walt observed. "It never really ends," Peterson said. "Just passes from one generation to the next." He gestured to the empty beach. "Sometimes I come here when it's quiet. Reminds me why we do this, not for the adrenaline or the glory, but for moments like yesterday, seeing these kids transform into something greater than themselves." Walt nodded, understanding. "Perfectly. The quiet moments matter as much as the dramatic ones." "Your speech yesterday," Peterson said, "it resonated, not just with the graduates but with the cadre, reminded us that what we're doing here isn't just training operators. We're preserving a legacy." "A legacy only matters if it evolves," Walt replied, "adapts to new realities while maintaining its core principles." "That's where you and the other veterans come in," Peterson said, "connecting past to present, helping us remember what matters beyond the tactics and technology." They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, two members of the same brotherhood, separated by decades but united by shared experience. Then Walt extended his hand. "Take care of them, Senior Chief. The ones who make it and the ones who don't. They're all part of the effort." Peterson shook his hand firmly. "Will do, Chief, and you'll be back?" "I'll be back," Walt confirmed. "Some things, once started, can't be abandoned." As Walt drove away from the Naval Special Warfare Center, he reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. From isolated retirement to reluctant mentor. From a man hiding from his past to one helping shape the future of the community he had helped build. The quiet old man at the shooting range had been recognized not just for who he had been, but for who he still was. A carrier of wisdom, a keeper of traditions, a living link in a chain that stretched back decades and would continue long after he was gone. His phone rang, the Bluetooth connecting the call to his car's speaker system. It was Chad Dennison from Atlantic Shores Range. "Walt, just checking if we're still on for the Veterans Program on Saturday. We've got 15 signed up already, including 3 from Vietnam era and 1 Korean War vet." "I'll be there," Walt promised. "Wouldn't miss it." As he ended the call, Walt smiled slightly. His calendar, once deliberately empty, now filled with purpose. Speaking engagements, mentorship meetings, veteran support activities, a life once defined by shadows, now lived increasingly in the light. The recognition that had begun with a SEAL recruit's whispered, "That's him," had cascaded into something Walt could never have anticipated, a renewed sense of belonging, of purpose, of continuity. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the Naval Special Warfare Center receding behind him. Not an ending, but another beginning. Another mission. Different from those of his operational career, but no less vital. The legacy would continue, and Walter Harrison, once content to be forgotten, would play his part in ensuring it endured. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that true wisdom comes from those who have walked the path before us, and that every generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before. Remember that sometimes the quietest among us carry the most profound stories. Stories that deserve to be heard, remembered, and honored. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.